The wind came down from the ridges like a voice angry with God. It howled through the naked trees and lifted the snow in great sweeping fists, swirling it against the face of the mountain. Below, in a narrow gulch hidden by brush and broken rock, a woman crouched near the mouth of a shallow cave, one hand gripping her swollen belly, the other bracing herself against the earth that had begun to tremble beneath her ribs. She was alone. No midwife, no man, no fire. Just her breath, short, sharp, painful, and the slow ache of the child she had carried for 9 months, now knocking against her bones with urgency. Her name was Clara Dane, the daughter of a preacher and the widow of a railroad worker who'd never come home from his last job in Dakota Territory. Or so she told folks. The truth was messier than that. The child was not born of marriage, but of love stolen in a moment too brief and too foolish, and the father was a drifter, a half-Mexican gambler with green eyes and a gentle laugh, who kissed her once beneath a cottonwood and vanished before the leaves even fell. The town had turned its back when her belly swelled. Her father locked the church doors and told the congregation she was no longer his blood. The women hissed scripture behind her, and the men, they looked at her with something between lust and pity, but none offered her a home. So Clara climbed into the hills when the pains began, knowing she'd rather die cold and alone than scream in front of those who had buried her in judgment long before her water broke. The cave was small, little more than a hollow in the granite wall. Snow blew into the entrance, and the cold bit her bare ankles. She had no blankets, only the shawl she'd wrapped around her shoulders, and the memory of her mother's voice, soft and distant. Push when it hurts. Breathe like the sea does. Life always comes in pain, but it comes. And so she did. For hours. She bit the corner of her sleeve to keep from crying out. She clawed the dirt. Her body split open with the weight of something sacred, and then, suddenly, there was silence. And then a cry. A tiny, defiant, living cry. Clara pulled the child to her chest, a boy slick with birth and blood, and already searching for her with clenched fists. Her hands trembled as she wrapped him in her shawl, tucking the edges tight around his purple skin. He was warm, breathing, real, and he looked like his father, God help her, like the very man who had left her behind. She whispered a prayer, though she wasn't sure if she still believed in anything but the boy in her arms. And then the wind shifted, not in sound, in feeling. There was someone outside. She felt it before she saw him, like a deer feels the eyes of the hunter long before the arrow flies. A silhouette at the mouth of the cave, broad shoulders, horse standing behind him, steam rising from its nostrils. His hair was long, braided, black as obsidian, with feathers tied near the end that whispered when he moved. He wore a blanket across his shoulders, stitched with red and gold diamonds of the Lakota. His eyes were the color of wet earth, watchful, quiet. Clara tensed, pulling the baby tighter against her chest. She could hardly breathe, let alone run. The warrior stepped forward, but not close. He knelt beside the fireless entrance and placed his hand on the snow-dusted ground as if feeling for something only he could understand. Then, with slow, deliberate movement, he laid down his weapons, bow, knife, hatchet, beside him, and turned his palms to the sky. A gesture older than language. I mean no harm. Clara stared at him, unsure whether to trust the silence. He spoke no English, or at least chose not to. But there was something in the way he sat, alert but not threatening, that told her she was safer than she had been in weeks. He didn't try to enter the cave. He didn't ask her name. He just stayed, all night. He stoked a fire from tinder he pulled from a leather pouch, sheltering the flame with cupped hands until it grew. He placed it just outside the cave's edge, far enough to keep his distance, close enough for her to feel its warmth. When the baby cried, he looked away, not out of fear, but out of reverence, like the cry was something holy. The wind softened, the snow slowed, and somewhere in the thick quiet of the mountains, Clara slept for the first time in days. Half sitting, the baby curled against her chest, a stranger keeping watch over them with the patience of stone. By dawn she would know his name, but that night she only knew his presence, and that was enough.
When Clara opened her eyes, the cave was drenched in pale gray light, the kind that comes just before the sun rises, when the world holds its breath and the shadows lose their claws. The baby stirred against her chest, letting out a tiny grunt before settling again. His breath was warm on her skin. She blinked hard, her body aching from where it had folded into itself through the long night. Outside the cave, the fire still burned low, its coals smoldering beneath a crust of ash. And the warrior was still there. He hadn't moved. He sat like a carved figure in the forgotten shrine, one leg bent, one stretched out, his blanket drawn tighter around his shoulders. Snow had settled on his hair and lashes, but he hadn't brushed it away. He faced outward, toward the mouth of the gulch, watching the narrow path below as though it might decide to spit out danger at any moment. Clara shifted slightly and winced. Her muscles were stiff, and the blood beneath her skin pulsed like bruises. She looked down at the child, her child, and touched his cheek. Still warm, still alive. The warrior turned at the sound of her movement. Their eyes met. For a long second, nothing passed between them, just breath, just snow. Then, without speaking, he reached slowly into the small leather satchel tied to his hip and pulled something from it, a strip of dried meat wrapped in bark, and a bundle of herbs bound by twine. He placed them gently on a flat stone near the edge of the fire, close enough for her to reach, but not so close as to startle her. Then he looked away again. Clara stared at the offering. Her stomach tightened. She hadn't eaten in over a day, and the smell of the dried meat made her mouth water. She reached for it slowly, watching him, testing his reaction. He didn't move. She ate in small bites, tearing pieces with her teeth like a feral thing, pausing only to let the baby nurse when he began to root against her. The herbs she didn't know what to do with, until the warrior took a few sprigs, crushed them between his palms, and sprinkled them over the fire. A sweet, sharp smell rose in the smoke. Mint, pine, a touch of wild lavender. It filled the cave and her lungs, and something else she hadn't expected. Calm. When she had eaten, and the child had fed, she wrapped him again in the shawl and whispered to him. She didn't care that the warrior was near. In fact, part of her wanted him to hear. Maybe because she didn't want to be the only witness to the words. Your name is Eli. That's what I would have told your father if he'd ever come back. The warrior's head tilted slightly, as though he heard something important but didn't know what it meant. Clara didn't explain. Let him wonder. He stood slowly, not abruptly, and walked down the slope a few paces, checking the tracks near the trees. His moccasins left almost no imprint, but he seemed to read the snow like scripture. After a moment he knelt and touched a set of prints. His brow furrowed. When he returned to the cave, he held up 2 fingers, then pointed toward the south. Clara didn't understand at first. 2 people? She guessed. Coming this way? He didn't answer, only nodded once, then drew a shape in the snow with his finger. A boot, not a moccasin. White men. Her blood ran cold. He wasn't just a man wandering the mountains. He was a scout, or a guardian, and now he was warning her. "Are they looking for me?" she whispered. Her voice cracked. "Do they know I ran?" The warrior said nothing. But then he stepped forward, closer than before, and pointed to the baby, then to her, then to his own chest, and with a fine motion he touched his fingers to his heart, then held them outward in a sign that could only mean one thing: "I will protect." Clara didn't know why it made her want to cry. Maybe because she hadn't heard those words since her mother died. Maybe because she didn't believe them. Not anymore. Not from anyone. But there was no lie in his eyes. He returned to his place by the fire and began preparing something from the satchel. Powdered bark. Dried roots. He mixed it with snow in a small wooden bowl and handed it to her. She sniffed it cautiously. "Medicine?" He nodded. She drank. It was bitter and earthy and made her stomach churn, but warmth began to spread through her body like an old song remembered. Later that morning, as the clouds rolled low and the wind shifted east, the warrior began to prepare the horses. Hers was a small brown mare she had left hobbled beneath the trees. He packed their belongings with swift, silent hands. He had no saddle, only a blanket and a rope halter. But he moved like a man who had lived more on horseback than on the ground. Clara watched him, holding Eli against her chest, her thoughts a blizzard. She had given birth in a cave among snow and stone, thinking no soul in the world would find her. But this man had. And now, somehow, he was part of their story.
The first step out of the cave was the hardest. Clara had spent the night in darkness, pain and fear, wrapped in blood and snow and silence. But somehow, in the hush before morning, she'd been folded into something else, a threadbare sense of safety, stitched not by words, but by presence. Now, as she followed the Lakota warrior down the narrow slope with Eli pressed against her chest, every part of her body screamed. Her legs trembled from the birth, and her arms shook from holding the child too tightly for too long. But she didn't ask for rest. She didn't complain. She had made it this far. She would keep moving. He led the way in silence, his steps sure and light, leaving hardly a mark in the snow. The wind had sharpened overnight, slicing across the trees like a knife made of ice. Clara pulled the blanket tighter around Eli and glanced over her shoulder. The cave disappeared behind a veil of white. For hours they walked. Not a single word passed between them. But still, she noticed him. The way he would stop every few minutes and listen, tilting his head slightly, his eyes scanning the trees as if he could hear snow melting under bark. The way he circled back whenever the terrain grew steep, offering his hand without looking her in the eye. The way he placed her steps with a stick in the snow, pointing where it was safest to walk so she wouldn't slip. His name she still didn't know, nor did she ask. But every step with him was a step further from death. That was all she needed to believe in. Near noon, they reached a ravine where the river had frozen into long veins of ice. The warrior led them across carefully, testing each foothold before letting her pass. Clara cradled Eli tighter, praying to whatever God still listened in these godless lands, that the ice wouldn't crack beneath them. It didn't. By the time they reached the other side, her breath came in ragged clouds. The warrior knelt beside a fallen pine and began clearing the snow to reveal dry bark beneath. He struck flint, coaxed flame, and soon a tiny fire crackled between two rocks. He didn't speak, just looked at her and nodded once as if to say, "Rest." She sat with Eli and let the fire kiss the numb from her fingers. The warrior unwrapped a bundle from his belt, dried meat again, but this time he handed it to her, in person, without the cold space of distance. Clara took it. Their fingers brushed. She didn't pull away. After a while, he sat opposite her, close enough that she could see the faint scar along her cheekbone. She wondered about that scar, how old it was, who had given it to him, why he hadn't flinched when she screamed in labor, but had flinched slightly when she said her baby's name. She decided to break the silence. "Why are you helping me?" The fire popped. He looked at her, not startled, not bothered, just thoughtful. She tried again, softer this time. "I mean, you didn't have to. You could have walked right past." Still nothing. Then, slowly, he pointed to the child, then to the sky, then pressed a hand to his chest. Clara frowned. A sign? From the spirits? He didn't confirm, but he didn't deny it either. She looked down at Eli, now asleep in her lap, his tiny hands curled like leaves, then back at the man.
"I don't even know your name." He drew it in the snow with a stick. Tasunke. She stared at the letters, clumsy in English script but precise. "Tasunke," she whispered. "What does it mean?" He paused, then held his palm flat, miming the motion of a horse galloping. "Horse?" she guessed. He nodded. She smiled for the first time in days. Fitting. They moved again before the sun could drop too far. The sky turned leaden and clouds thickened in the west. By dusk, the trees grew denser, the snow deeper. Tasunke stopped once to listen, then pointed to a ridge. Up there, she saw it too. Boot prints. Not moccasins, not animal, boots, fresh. A chill swept over her that had nothing to do with the snow. Her past was catching up. Tasunke didn't hesitate. He turned them eastward, deeper into the forest where the pines closed tight and the light turned greenish-gray. He moved faster now, his hand always near the hatchet at his belt. Clara had to bite her tongue not to cry out as her legs gave way on a slope, but he caught her without a word, lifted her, carried her. She wanted to argue, to say she could walk, that she wasn't helpless. But then she looked at Eli in her arms and at the man holding them both, and she knew this was not a moment for pride. By nightfall, they reached a place sheltered by stone ledges where snow couldn't touch the ground. Tasunke built another fire, this one shielded from the wind by pine branches. He set snares nearby, his motions silent and fluid, like someone used to sleeping one eye open. When he returned, Clara looked at him across the firelight. Her voice was barely a whisper. "They're looking for me." He said nothing, but she continued. "I ran from a man named Burke. He bought me from my uncle for 5 silver coins and a mule. Said I was property now. Said I would give him a child or he'd beat it out of me." Tasunke didn't blink. "I ran 2 weeks before Eli came," she added. "Rode through the night, slept in barns, hid in a dried-up well once. I thought maybe the snow would hide me." Tears touched her cheeks, freezing at the edges. "But he's still coming, isn't he? He won't stop." Tasunke leaned forward and threw a new branch into the fire. Sparks rose. Then he looked her dead in the eye. He held up 2 fingers, then sliced them down like a blade. 2 men, dead. Clara's breath caught. He wasn't just protecting her. He was hunting them.
Snow fell thick, like whispers of ancient spirits. The wind howled through the cliffs, lashing skin like a frozen whip from the heavens. Clara held the baby close, wrapped tight in a blanket of deerskin, pressed against her chest to share warmth. Ahead of her, Tasunke walked in silence, leading the horse, his eyes sharp, as if he could hear the voice of the earth beneath the frozen crust. She was no longer afraid of him. Between them now was a wordless trust, built from that first night in the cave, from the way he quietly roasted meat and gave her the lion's share, from the silent way he held the baby as she cried through the pain. But now that silence grew heavier. Something was coming. Tasunke stopped. He crouched low, his fingers brushing a faint track in the snow. "Someone's following," he said, voice deep like the mountains. Clara tightened her grip on the child, wind stinging her cheeks. "It's him." Tasunke looked up at her. "You know this man?" "His name is Boyd Turner. He worked for my husband, the man who sold me out. Boyd thinks I know where the money is hidden, and now he wants it all, even the baby." Tasunke stared at her for a long moment. In his eyes a quiet fire burned. "You don't need to run any more." "What do you mean?" "The storm is coming. It will cover the trail, but it will also be the time to choose, run again or face it once and for all." Clara looked around. They stood at the edge of a pine forest. Ahead lay jagged cliffs, behind them the tracks of the man chasing them. The baby slept soundly in her arms, tiny lips curled in peace. She looked at Tasunke. He stood firm, unmoving, like part of the land itself. The wind tugged at his long leather-bound hair and whispered across a faded scar on his neck. For the first time, she wondered, what had this man lost? She asked, "You'd help me?" He simply nodded. "I do not guard you because of a debt. I do it because I choose to." That sentence struck her like a bell tolling in some forgotten church. It had been so long since someone wanted nothing from her except to believe she deserved to live. In the distance, the thundering of hooves echoed, fast, heavy, cruel. Boyd was coming. Tasunke pulled his bow from the horse's saddle, checking each arrow with care. He gestured for Clara to follow him along the cliffside to a narrow crevice, half hidden by snowdrifts. There he built a small fire, not for warmth, but to cast the final light before the storm. Clara kissed her baby's forehead. The choice was clear now. There would be no more running. She turned to Tasunke and said, "We face this together." He looked at her, and in his gaze was no longer just a warrior, but a companion, a heart that knew pain and sacrifice. Outside, the blizzard began to howl like a beast awakened, but in their hearts, a different peace had begun to rise. The snow fell sideways now, wild and merciless. The fire in the narrow crevice crackled low, its flame a trembling heart against the breath of the storm. Clara sat with the baby cradled close, wrapped in Tasunke's buffalo cloak. Her eyes fixed on the warrior crouched at the edge of the rocks, bow in hand, eyes narrowed toward the wind. Tasunke had barely spoken since the howling began, but Clara could feel it in the way his shoulders shifted. He was ready. Not eager, not angry, just ready, like the earth before thunder. A rifle cracked in the distance. A bullet tore into the cliffside. Stone chipped near Clara's head. She ducked, heart thundering. The baby stirred, but didn't cry. Tasunke turned his head slightly. "Stay down. He's alone, but drunk with greed." Another shot rang out. Then a voice. "Clara, you got nowhere to go now. I'm taking what's mine." Clara's hands trembled. "He'll kill us." "No," Tasunke said. "He wants to scare you. He doesn't know I'm here." Then silence. The snow swallowed sound, wrapped the mountains in a frozen hush. Even Boyd's voice vanished. But Clara could feel him nearby, crawling like a wolf between trees. Tasunke moved, silent as breath. He disappeared into the storm. Clara's chest tightened. Alone again, but not like before. This time someone had gone into the dark for her. Minutes dragged like lifetimes. Then another shot, close, and then nothing. The wind shifted, and through the white mist a shape returned. Tasunke. He was limping, blood on his sleeve. Clara stood quickly. "You're hurt!" He shook his head. "Not deep." She looked past him. "Where's Boyd?" Tasunke's eyes darkened. Gone. He chose the fight. He lost. He sat slowly, holding his side. Clara knelt beside him, wrapping a cloth around the wound. "You didn't have to do this." "I did," he said. "You stopped running. So did I." They stayed there until the storm passed, sitting shoulder to shoulder in silence. In the morning, the sun rose over a world made new, white, clean, quiet. Clara stepped out of the crevice. Snow covered all tracks, even Boyd's. She looked up at the sky, then back at the cave where her child had been born. A beginning shaped in fear, now wrapped in a strange, unexpected hope. Later, as they packed to leave, she asked softly, "Where will you go now?" Tasunke looked to the horizon. "North. There is land where winter ends early, safer for the child." She nodded, holding the baby close. Then quietly, "Can we come with you?" He looked at her for a long time, not as a warrior, not as a stranger, but as a man who had watched her walk through fire and snow without breaking. "Yes," he said. And that was all. They rode together into the morning sun, one Lakota warrior, one white woman who had stopped running, and a newborn child who had known only the warmth of a cave and the shield of love. In the world's silence, a new family was born, not by blood, but by choice. And the snow behind them never spoke a word of what had come before.